Epilogue. In the Mission, Kelowna, BC. Thursday, not quite 1 week later. Doreen Montgomery stood in the open doorway to her kitchen. Her kitchen. There was just something about settling into this house finally, with the chaos under control, and something like normality entering her life. Well, as long as normality could include her 3 very unique and personable pets. It was weird, but the phrase settling into this house to her meant having a cup of coffee or tea whenever she wanted it, going to bed when she was ready, and sitting in the garden because she wanted to. And boy did she want all that. Even better, some days she could take a step out her front door without being accosted by somebody wanting more details on the recently solved murders. Somehow she'd become a celebrity in the small town of Kelowna. But she really didn't want that role. At least it took the townsfolk's focus off her status as a penniless 35-year-old almost divorcee, living in her grandmother's home. Yet Doreen was determined to handle her new life, sans chefs and gardeners and maids and chauffeurs. Doreen could handle most of that herself, except for one thing. Doreen couldn't cook. Which was why she had to face down this most terrifying thing of all things in her kitchen. She strode forward to fill Nan's tea kettle and placed it on the stove, the appliance she had a hate-hate relationship with. She turned the dial to light the gas, but of course there was no blue flame. However, immediately she could smell gas wafting toward her nose. She snapped off the dial and glared. "You're not a stove. You're a diabolical demon. I don't understand how you work, what makes you work, and why the hell anybody would want something like you in the house," she announced to anyone nearby. The only ones listening were Muggs, her pedigreed basset hound, content to lay on the floor out of the way, and Thaddeus, Nan's huge beautiful blue-gray parrot with long red tail feathers, currently walking on the kitchen table, hoping for food scraps. "I've already fed you this morning, Thaddeus." Doreen shook her head. She should have never let him eat there. Now she'd never be able to keep him off her breakfast table. Goliath took that moment of calm to appear, racing around the kitchen, through Doreen's legs, and out again into the living room area. "Goliath!" Doreen yelled, righting herself. "Stop doing that, or you'll end up hurting me and you too." Goliath was the gigantic golden Maine Coon cat, the size of a bobcat, that came with the house. Goliath, being Goliath, was disruptive, picking any inopportune moment he could possibly find, yet sleeping the rest of the time. Initially, Doreen had considered Goliath's races through the house were in pursuit of a mouse, heaven forbid, but Doreen had never seen one or any evidence of one inside. She decided this was Goliath's normal behavior. Sighing, Doreen glared again at her stove. "Is it too much to ask for hot water for my tea? Other people manage to produce incredible meals by using one of these things." And then there was Doreen. Her stove was a black gas-powered devil. Yet she was determined to not let it get the better of her. Again she reached forward to turn on the gas and then froze. She couldn't do it. What if something was wrong with the gas line? What if something really was broken? At least that gave her an excuse to stop her half-assed attempts at cooking. She grinned at that thought. Feeling like it was a cop-out but grateful nonetheless, she picked up the electric tea kettle she'd found in the back of Nan's pantry when Doreen had first arrived, filled it with water, and plugged it in. Then she pushed the button on its side and waited for the water to heat up. That's the best way to make tea anyway. She comforted herself with that thought as her gaze returned to the stove. "Damn thing." Right behind her popped up a voice. "Damn thing. Damn thing." Talking parrots should require an owner's manual, and circumspect owners. She turned and shook her finger at Thaddeus. "Don't you repeat that. Damn thing. Damn thing. Damn thing." She stared at the African gray parrot with her hands on her hips, worried that now Thaddeus would swear at the most awkward moments. like with every other terrible thing he'd learned to say since she'd arrived. Another first. Doreen was free to swear now. Free to say anything she wanted. Throwing off the shackles of her marriage had also freed her tongue. Maybe not such a good thing. She did have an image to uphold. She wasn't exactly sure what that image was yet, but it was here somewhere, and she was supposed to uphold it. Nan's image had been tarnished for a little bit with the recent murder cases. But Doreen had cleared Nan's name, and that was what counted. Such a sense of peace flowed through Doreen now, as if she'd somehow successfully passed a major test, probably one of many as she made this major life transition. Muggs waddled over and rubbed against her thigh, giving a bark. "I haven't forgotten you, you silly boy." Doreen bent to give him a quick ear rub. When he barked again, now sitting at her feet giving her that woeful look, she reminded him, "I've already fed you too." As the tea kettle bubbled beside her, she opened the kitchen's back door and stepped onto the long flowing veranda along the rear of the house. The dark slash beside the second set of veranda steps at the far end, where one of the bodies had been dug out, was still a raw insult to the garden that should have been here. And of course, the rest of the garden was even worse. She wanted to wander and plan and design how and what she could do with this space, but, since she had no money, it was hard to imagine any workable options at this time. At least, she had no pressure to do all of it now. That brought back memories, when she had been only a decoration on a rich man's arm, how she directed gardeners to do what she wanted, regardless of the cost. As she stared at her massive backyard space, non-stop ideas filtered in. She smiled with delight, then walked back inside, grabbed her pad of paper and a pencil, and was about to step outside again when she realized the tea kettle was still on. That had never bothered her before, but now she couldn't leave the house while any appliance was running. The thought of having this house, her home, burned to the ground was too unnerving. She'd only recently settled into having something of her own, and couldn't bear to lose it. Making tea for herself over the past couple days had been an eye-opening experience. She used to get fancy lattes with beautiful patterns on the top without realizing they came from a $5,000 machine and a skilled barista. What she could do with $5,000 right now. She cringed every time she thought about the seemingly insignificant cost of one of those fancy lattes that she'd consumed on a daily basis when married. A humble cup of home-brewed tea was a simple pleasure now, those fancy coffees an indulgence. Something she could no longer afford. She waited until the tea kettle fully boiled, then dropped a tea bag into a large chipped mug Nan had left behind and poured the boiling water atop it. Checking the fridge, she was relieved to find a little bit of milk left inside an open carton. She opened the top, took a whiff, and grinned. It was still sweet. She poured a splash into her tea, put the carton back into the fridge, picked up her cup, and said to Muggs, "Are you ready to go outside?" Muggs barked joyfully at the trigger word. The door was already open, but she propped it to stay that way with one of the chairs off the veranda. Muggs ran forward, his great big saggy facial jowls wobbling and shaking with every step. Thaddeus flew overhead, although how the bird could fly Doreen didn't know. When she had first arrived, he didn't fly much. Now he did a half soaring and half free fall to the ground. But he did it very elegantly. Or at least it would be elegant if the words pouring out of his mouth weren't "damn thing." Damn thing. Why did he have to repeat himself? She had heard him the first time, unfortunately. Goliath raced past again, his tail in the air. Apparently, this was a family outing. She chuckled. It was a beautiful day and everything felt right. She wandered the far back area of the property, her entourage in tow. The paperwork still had to be processed to legally transfer the house, compliments of her grandmother, into Doreen's name. Nan had chosen to move into a nearby senior's home and had left her house to Doreen. She'd been absolutely stunned and heartened by Nan's generosity at a time when Doreen had been desperately in need of a place to call home and a pillow to lay her head on at night. Thaddeus flew down and landed on her shoulder. Doreen stroked the beautiful bird's head. Good bird. But Thaddeus didn't repeat that. Figures. Now she wandered the backyard, taking delight in the garden, knowing it was hers forever. Even though overwhelmed with weeds, the garden held so much potential. Seeing several small trees in the mix, Doreen walked closer and gasped. Fruit trees, she cried out in joy. Bending down to avoid the unruly branches, she studied the leaves and identified an Italian plum, maybe an apricot too, and one she wasn't sure of, possibly a cherry tree. Fruit trees were a delightful addition to her garden. This place could shine with a little effort. Everything outside came alive in her mind as she contemplated the improvements she could make. Doreen heard muffled grunts and stopped to see what Muggs was digging up. Thankfully, it was just dirt this time. Gardening was Doreen's one and only talent. But designing a garden that somebody else would implement was a whole different story than making it happen by her own elbow grease. She didn't know the last time she'd held a shovel in her hand. She wasn't at all sure how much physical strength would be required to clean up this backyard. Plus, she'd signed on to do some gardening for Mac's mother, hopefully for some much-needed money. Just the reminder of the local detective who'd helped her navigate the nightmare of finding several bodies in her garden last week made her chuckle. He was a very interesting man. And likely thought she was nuts. Then it had been a crazy week, her first week living in one of the oldest neighborhoods in Kelowna Mission, so she could hardly blame him. Mac had helped her through this trying time. He had been a godsend when the bodies had showed up at her place. Not that the dead bodies were her fault by any means, but somehow she happened to trip over them. Or maybe she should blame Goliath. Or Muggs. They had both helped, or hindered. Then there was Thaddeus. She frowned as she watched her brood, especially the dog sniffing deep into the brush. Muggs, don't you dare find any more bodies, she warned. We've had more than enough corpses in our world. Muggs gave a heavy woof and continued to waddle forward, the grass splitting wide to let his girth through. She grinned. He had been with her for 5 years already. She had inherited both Goliath and Thaddeus from Nan, as part and parcel with her house. Goliath had an attitude. He came and went on his own, and still demanded that she look after him when he did show up. Kind of like her soon-to-be ex-husband. Only Goliath had had his tomcat ways fixed, and her almost ex-husband had not. She chuckled at that. That's what we should have done. We should have had him fixed. Then he wouldn't have brought home another arm ornament and booted me out. Regardless, she was better off without him. Now all she had to do was figure out how to make money. At least enough to keep the electricity on in the house and food in the fridge. It was proving to be a bigger challenge than she'd realized. But that wasn't today's problem. She walked over to the dilapidated fence, built out of several different materials, each of them finding their own unique way of partially crumbling to the ground. It might keep out some people, but it sure as hell wouldn't keep out anybody who didn't want to stay out. She wished she could afford brand new fencing all the way around the property, because that would be the place to start. Structural work first, then do the prettier stuff. In this case, she wasn't sure how to do the structural stuff, especially on a shoestring budget. She walked to the rickety, now broken gate, Muggs behind her, Thaddeus still on her shoulder, Goliath off somewhere, unlooped the wire from the post and pulled it open. She stepped outside to the path and the pretty creek that ran behind her property. She didn't want the fence along here at all. Most of it was past saving anyway. About 140 feet of the creek's footage area was a beautiful sight to see from her backyard, much more so than a dilapidated fence. She looked closer at the creek, not sure to call it a creek or a river. Right now it was more of a babbling brook. But she imagined, later this spring, it could get a little bit uglier. Still, the creek's bank had a decent slope, so flooding shouldn't be much of a problem. She spotted a place where she could set up a little flagstone patio to sit and to enjoy the water. Thaddeus flew from her shoulder to land near the water, strutting around, looking hopefully for fish and bugs. No defined pathway was on this side of the creek, and everybody else's property was fenced off from the creek too. She thought that was such a shame. The creek offered a beautiful, peaceful view. She walked back to her rearmost fence, put her pad of paper and teacup down on a rock, then grasped a fence post and shook it to see how strong it was. Instantly the fence made a low groaning sound and bent over sideways. She jumped back, crying out, "Oh no!" But whatever she'd done had been too much for the old wood. Several of the fence panels toppled to the side, creating a bigger mess than she'd intended. Muggs came closer, but she shooed him away. "No, Muggs. Stay back. You could hurt yourself on a nail." As she retreated into her backyard, coaxing Muggs with her, and stared toward the babbling brook, she laughed. "It might not be the way I had planned to do this, Muggs, but the end result is beautiful. It really opened up the view." She took Muggs's silence to be acquiescence. Some really nice overhanging willows were on the far side of the brook, and her property had other trees dotted along the remains of her back fence. She had a small bridge just at the other end of the property that she could access. In fact, it was a beautiful scene. Enthused by what she'd accidentally started, she returned to the remainder of her fence and gave it a shake. And sure enough, 3/4 of the rest of the creekside fence fell to the ground, almost grateful to give up the effort to stand any longer. With a big smile, she walked to the last piece of this section, all wire fencing with iron rods deep into the ground. She pushed and pulled on the first iron rod, hoping it would be loose too. The first one was, but the second one wasn't. She managed to lift up one and watched as most of the wire fencing fell into a big, snarly mess around the next pole still standing. What she really needed was a handyman to finish pulling out the fence and to haul it off, but she didn't have one. That brought back unwanted memories of last week's events. The only handyman she had known of in town had been murdered. With a shake of her head, she returned to the problem at hand. She wasn't sure how much yard debris she could transport in her small Honda. A truck would be helpful to make a trip to the dump. She wondered what it would take to get somebody big and strong to come give her a hand. On that thought, Mac came to mind. Again. The detective was well over 6 foot, his shoulders were almost as broad as he was tall. He was a big mountain of a man. But so far he'd been very gentle and kind to her. Although she exasperated him more than anything. But all for the right reasons. Unfortunately, Doreen wasn't sure Mac believed that though. Nor had he believed her at first about the dead bodies. It took closing an old cold case and several more current cases before he did. So all in all, Mac should be thanking her. Maybe he should even be paying her for her assistance. She brightened for a moment, contemplating the idea of a fat check coming from the local Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and then shook her head. Not going to happen. She shrugged. It was her current reality. And, for whatever it was worth, she was a whole lot happier now than when she had been a plastic Barbie, who never worried about money. She stared at the scratch on her palm, blood already welling up. She should have worn gardening gloves. No point looking at her damaged nails. Besides, she couldn't see them for the dirt. "Doreen?" She spun around and yelled, "I'm in the back." She turned toward the felled wire fence and sighed. This would make a mess of her hands. And possibly her back. She headed to her teacup, scooped it off the rock, and took a sip. When she heard footsteps, she pivoted to see Mac walking toward her, holding Goliath while scratching his furry head and talking to Muggs who had run to greet him. She set down her cup and beamed. There was just something about Mac. Mac grinned, setting the cat free on the grass, giving Muggs a smile and a quick ear rub. Leave you alone for a week and look at you. You're ripping apart the place. She laughed. Well, someone had to, she said with a smile. Thaddeus decided to join them now, landing inside the backyard. Hey boy, Mac said, waiting for the bird to walk to him for a quick pat on the head. All three animals clustered nearby to watch the big man. What brings you by? Doreen asked. He pointed to the front of the house. Is that crowd bothering you? She shrugged. The notoriety is definitely different. Can't say I'm accustomed to it. However, the stress is easing slightly. Well, you are accustomed to notoriety, just not necessarily at this level. She winced at the reminder of her wealthy now estranged husband, and the number of times she'd been photographed as his partner, at one do or another. She nodded. Point to you. Doesn't necessarily mean I like the sensationalism though. He motioned to the fence. Did you mean to take that down? She glared at him. Does it look like I did it by accident? He laughed. With you, anything's possible. He walked over and tested the corner post. This won't stand for long either. He looked at the long and rambling busted-up fence on the side edge of her property, shared with one neighbor, and the big fancy fence butted up against it that was her neighbor's. Are you going to remove this side too? Is there any reason I can't and just use the neighbor's fence? He shrugged. That's what I'd do. With a big fat smile, she asked, Can you pull out the last of those posts? She was almost rubbing her hands together in joy at the thought of getting rid of this huge eyesore. Having this much of the ragtag fencing down had opened up so much of the creek's natural beauty that she couldn't wait to get rid of the rest of her creekside fence. It seemingly took him nothing but the same effort to lift a cup of coffee, and he had the huge iron post up and out of the ground. She couldn't even rock the pole slightly. It's a big mess back here, Max said. For now, the only good place to drag this old fencing is in the middle of the backyard. It'll take some of this plant stuff here with it. That plant stuff you're talking about happens to be perennial bushes that I would like to keep. He glared at her but twisted so he had the post with both hands, pulled it higher over his head, and dragged what he could toward the center of her backyard where it ended up in a big heap on the lawn. You'll need some good wire cutters to clip this into manageable pieces. What I need is a truck to make a trip to the dump, she announced. I can't get very much in my car at one time. After you work on Mom's garden project, we'll probably make a trip to the dump, depending on how much yard waste we need to get rid of at Mom's house and how much new compost we may need to add. We can always take some of your yard debris at the same time. She beamed. Now that would be lovely. Then she frowned. I don't think I have any tools that will cut up this wire fencing. I don't know. Nan had a whole pile of them in the hall closet. Doreen glanced at him in surprise, and then remembered the hall closet full of an odd assortment of things. You could be right. I'll go check. She started toward the house before suddenly turning and calling out, Careful. Don't hurt those plants. He shot her a look but continued to struggle with the posts. Leaving him standing there, tugging at more fencing, trying to pull it up without damaging the plants, she headed inside to the closet. Once there, she wasn't exactly sure what wire cutters looked like. She found a hammer though. She needed that to pull out the nails in the wooden boards on the fallen pieces of fencing. She grabbed what looked like 2 pairs of something, possibly what she needed, and with the hammer raced back outside. As she reached Mac, she held them up and said, Ta-da. He took one look and his smile fell away. He started to laugh. What's wrong with that? He pointed to one and said, those are fancy toenail clippers for a dog. She stared at them and then over at Muggs, who gave her a look that could have said, don't you dare. She shook her head. I've never seen any like this. It certainly won't cut wire. Now these, on the other hand, he said, taking the other pair that looked like weird shears to her, will probably do it. He tested them on the center post he had pulled out. Instantly, the wire snapped under his grip. He went to the main rod, cutting the wire off there, and said, now do that to every one of those posts, and separate the wire so you can roll it into a bundle. She nodded eagerly. I can do that. While she'd been searching for tools, he'd pulled out the rest of the main posts. Some of the plants were likely damaged, but she would spend the afternoon cutting this fencing monstrosity into something easier to handle. She smiled. You can see how much better it looks already. He turned and studied her massive backyard all the way to the creek, and nodded. You're right. Just getting rid of that ugly nightmare has opened it up beautifully. But you don't want a fence at the back? She shook her head. No, I want to see the creek. It's beautiful. She led him to where she'd been standing earlier. I think I would put a patio in here. Don't let the government know about that, he warned. This is a riparian zone. You're not allowed to do anything without a mess of permits. She lifted her eyebrows. Permits? It's my land. Why can't I put down some flagstones? He shrugged. All I can tell you is, you'll probably need a permit to do even that much. She frowned, disgruntled. The last thing she wanted was anybody to stop her gardening fun. I can just make it gravel then. I don't know. That's not a top priority. I have this lovely bank and a small path and the bridge. Although old, it's solid. Except for where she'd put her foot through one of the boards last week. The bridge theoretically could be used by anyone, but she'd never seen anybody walking that creekside path, as it was quite overgrown and not very popular. But for Muggs, it was a great way to get exercise. He could use it. Just then, Thaddeus hopped onto the pad of paper on the rock, sending it and her pencil flying into her teacup. The teacup fell with a crash to the rocks below, and Thaddeus hopped farther away from the damage. But of course, in his high piercing voice he called out, damn thing. Damn thing. Oh, Thaddeus, why do you say that? She walked over, collected the busted pieces of china and the pad of paper, now covered in tea. It was her fault. She shouldn't have put it here. But she had no table or outdoor chairs at this spot that she could have otherwise used. I see you're teaching him more words. Mac kept his voice carefully bland. She sent him a suspicious look. Not intentionally. He chuckled. I'm pretty sure that damn bird will pick up everything you don't want him to. Thaddeus looked at Mac with beady eyes, tilted his head to one side, and said, damn bird. Damn bird. Damn bird. She groaned. Watch what you say around him. Mac held out his hands. Me. I'm not the one who taught him the first phrase. But now you have taught him the second one, she snapped. Before we know it, he'll know all the curse words and shock the neighbors. I think you've already shocked the neighbors, Mac said with a grin. Finding bodies, capturing a murderer, and solving a case that has been cold for a long time all definitely counts as shocking the neighbors. She blushed at the admiration in his tone. Well, I did my best. Besides, you needed my help. I did not need your help, he blustered. I have been a detective for a long time, solving crimes well before you ever came here. Yes, but you didn't solve this one, did you? She couldn't help teasing him. Well, how was I to know you had a body hidden on your property? She shrugged. At least we solved it, she said, magnanimously adding, the two of us together. He hesitated, tilted his head in her direction. Okay, I'll give you that. We did that one together. She beamed. Now that Thaddeus has emptied my tea and broken my cup, do you want to go inside and have a cup of tea? He shook his head. I'll take a rain check on that. I stopped by to ask if you could come to my mother's house. She's got a patch of begonias she's fretting about. I don't know if you can fix them. But while we're there, we could discuss what to do and when. Doreen donned her expert gardener face. Of course I know how to deal with ailing begonias. I have begonias here that need to get into the ground. They were dug out when your department came and removed the body. The first one. He nodded. And since I mentioned that begonias had been pulled out here, my mother has been fretting over the begonias in her garden. When do you want to go? He hesitated. I don't want her to worry, so would you mind coming with me now, just to take a quick look? We'll come up with a plan on what we can do with them. Excited, Doreen said, absolutely. Let's go. They walked around to the driveway. Ignoring the people standing and staring outside her house, not saying a word to anyone, Doreen hopped into his truck, Muggs trying to follow her. Okay if Muggs rides with us? Only it wasn't just Muggs as Goliath raced toward them, Thaddeus squawking from the porch before soaring in their direction. Everyone? Really? Max sighed and allowed time for Doreen to pick up her menagerie. When they were all in the vehicle, he reversed out of her driveway and drove the 5 minutes to his mother's house. It was close enough to walk, but then they would have been accosted by all the curious onlookers. As they got out of his vehicle, he said, she should be napping still. I left her ready to go to sleep and came straight to your place. They slipped around to the back, and he pointed out a large patch that wasn't doing very well. Doreen sighed. If these are begonias, they've definitely seen better days. She wandered the large 6-foot-plus patch and then bent down on her hands and knees, plunging her fingers into the dirt, checking and testing the soil. I'm not exactly sure what's wrong with them. Is there a shovel handy? He brought over a small spade. She dug in close to the roots on the first bush, pulling up some of the dirt so she could see the root system. After scooping away several spades full, she stopped, brushed off some of the dirt against the tubers, and took a closer look. They're definitely not happy. How often are they getting water? There are sprinklers and soaker hoses on timers. So they should be getting plenty. She nodded and shifted her spade back a little bit, so she could pull out more dirt. Some perlite was all around the base of the plant, but the black dirt was decent. Although plenty of clay was here too, it appeared to be absorbing enough water. As she pulled up another handful, she froze. Mac bent down beside her. What's the matter? She plucked up something white, dropping it in his hand. She turned to look at him. Is this what I think it is? He frowned, shook his head, but his mouth opened and then he froze. I sure as hell hope not. It would be fitting, she said in a dark tone. How? He barked, his gaze on what was in his hand. She snickered. Bones in the begonias, anyone? This concludes Book 1 of Lovely Lethal Gardens, Arsenic in the Azaleas.